Hi, my name is Junhang Zhou. I'm a undergraduate studying applied math right now. As for school, I'm going to be a senior this year. I took Asian American history as a requirement for general education in school. Before taking this class, I knew nothing about the history of Asian Americans and their struggles in the past and present. I didn't know about a few recent events dealing with the laws of immigration of Asian Americans. However, I have no idea of the connection between these immigration laws and the issue of race, the law of citizenship, the history of labor in United States, the and the interaction of the U.S. with Asia. For my interview with my family member, I decided to go with my mom, Cindy, because she is very familiar figure in my life, and our life, our lives and history pretty much related to the topic of Asian Americans' history and immigration and how immigration laws have evolved through time and how they have affected people's life, especially people who are trying to come to this country. And I mentioned before, my mom and I are both U.S. permanent residents holding a green card, and I have lived in this country for a long time. While my mom visits me every now and then, because of this, I can see how immigration laws affect our lives.
Hi, my name is Cindy, and I'm CFO of a company in Beijing. I grew up in a small city in Hebei province and through hard work moved to Beijing, where I built my career and live today. I was very surprised to learn that Zheng Hang chose to interview me for his project on Asian American history, and I had thought that he chose me because we could talk face to face, as I am his mom. What I know about moving to this US is that there are many procedures that have to be followed, such as filling out forms, attending interviews, and going through approval process. However, I have never really delved into the history and the reasoning behind the rules and how the system has evolved over time. As I told a green card, it is all very relevant to my life and to that of my son.
Before I began presenting the topic of course of Asian American history that I found most relevant, could you tell me what part of Asian American history you felt you know at least about?
I'm interested in learning where the U.S. laws come from regarding permanent residents, foreign workers, and other immigrants. I'm familiar with the process that my son and I have to go through to apply for a green card for permanent resident status for ourselves, to have our interviews and to wait for approval. However, I have no idea where the system comes from or how different categories of citizens, immigrants, and others have been treated under past laws.
A chronological overview of the major developments in immigration law can be an effective framework or overview of the major issues in this area of laws and the various major events and the government's decisions that have shaped the laws regulating to regulating immigration. Looking at an issue such as immigration through the laws which attempt to regulate it, however, has limitations. For example, even the best of laws have been carried out in less than favorable ways by the various law enforcement officials responsible for enforcing such legislation. Often the courts have even interpreted the various laws passed by the legislature in ways that were centrally not anticipated by the lawmaker who draft such legislations. Thus, the laws that are viewed as to be most favorable to immigrants can, in different contexts, evoke the greatest amount of suspicion. Reading the rest of the reading of the course really made the second final question of the section really relevant to me, having been a legal permanent resident of the U.S. for most of my life, and my mom having gone through the same process as well. It was really interesting to read about the history of the law that were created to govern the regulate the flow of immigration to the U.S. and how different groups of people were affected by these laws. Three key episodes or laws in the history of the laws of the U.S. regarding permanent residents, foreign workers, and immigrants in general are the anti-Asian legislation promoted at the federal level in the late 19th century, including the Page Act of 1875 and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Immigration Act of 1924, or the Quanta Act and the Immigration of Nationality Act of 1965, also known as the Hart-Celler Act. The Page Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act attempted to stop immigration from Asia into the U.S. A national origin quota system was introduced by the Immigration Act of 1924. Northern and Western countries were granted the highest quotas, while Southern and Eastern European countries such as Italy, Greece, Turkey were granted to the lowest. People of Asian descent were largely banned from immigration of the U.S. for many decades to come, based on racist notions as to who make good immigration and who would not. The 1924 Immigration Act moved control of immigration to the federal government. It was during this time and that countries that allowed American trade and investment allowed their citizens to apply for visas at the American consulate in their countries prior to their journey to the U.S. When they arrived at the U.S. ports of entry, they would then be inspected by the U.S. immigration officers and granted entry into the country. Legal status of immigrants would become an increasingly important factor to the immigrants coming to the U.S. This system of national origins quotas would remain in the place for 40 years until it was abolished by the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. This act made a major change in immigration policy by placing an emphasis of family ties and or employment opportunities of prospective immigrants to the United States rather than or on geographic origins of applicants. As people of Asian orange and the others from around the world gained permission to enter the U.S., they incorporated a complex and often restricted system which governed their entry into the country and their lives there once they have arrived. Lecture 9 on U.S. immigration laws and how immigrants travel to the U.S. and try to make a life for themselves here helps me understand better to the connection between race, gender, work, and American power abroad, and the U.S. immigration laws and practice.
Immigration law attempts to allow or deny entry to people in the U.S. and to deport people who are already residents in the country. In addition, it creates categories of legal status of people currently residing in the U.S. and grants them different rights and privileges as immigrants with different status.
Today's lecture focusing on one of the dimensions of the U.S. immigration laws, namely the laws that create different categories of legal status for individuals who are already residing in this country and grant different rights and privilege to individuals with different status. How this different status can affect the lives of immigrants who are currently residing in this country is also discussed in this lecture. This way of laws dealing with people already residing in the country have a huge impact on the people already residing in the country. It determines whether or not people already residing in the country can work in the country, travel in and out of the country, receive public assistance and use the public assistance, vote, and even whether they can remain in the country or get deported. The case of Wong Kim Ark, a Chinese man born in San Francisco in 1973 to Chinese parents residing in the U.S. at the time of his birth, tested the limits of immigration policy and the meaning of citizenship. When the United States first established laws of naturalization, and the government established the law on a racial basis. For example, the Naturalization Act of 1790 granted citizenship after full and due fulfillment of the requirements of previous laws to any alien being free white person who had declared the intention to become a citizen of the United States and who had resided within the United States for the previous 5 years and within the states or territory in which applying for citizenship for the previous year. The Naturalization Act of 1870 granted the same rights of naturalization to a person of African nativity who were born or naturalized naturalized citizens of a country or place. Individuals of Asian birth or naturalization have continuously been denied such rights. Although he was a U.S. citizen because his Chinese appearance, immigration officials refused to allow him to re-enter the country. His long and different journey to the Supreme Court culminated in the landmark decision in 1998. Again, Wong Kim Ark was a Chinese American, the son of Chinese immigration, and thus his case has very little relevance to Chinese immigrants who were born outside of the U.S., let alone their struggles of naturalization. Rather, after the court's ruling in Wong Kim Ark's case, Chinese immigrants were allowed to naturalize for the first time. However, Chinese immigration was heavily restricted after the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and Chinese immigration were largely barred from naturalizing even after the court's ruling in Wong Kim Ark case. Wong Kim Ark case didn't have too much of the impact on the lives of Chinese American who was born outside of the U.S. His case didn't help establish the fact that after the court's ruling in Wong Kim Ark case, Chinese immigrants were allowed to naturalize for the first time. However, Chinese immigration was heavily restricted after the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. As a result, Chinese immigrants were largely barred from naturalizing even after the court's ruling in Wong Kim Ark case. Thus, although Wong Kim Ark gained an important legal right in court, the decision in his case was by no means the end of the story of Chinese Americans and the unfair laws that impacted their lives. I'm reminded here of the limits of studying immigration laws as a historical subject. A court decision is granted to a person to recognize rights that they have, but that does not mean that immediately society is going to change its way in terms of how they treat people. It is the actions of individuals that can make change within our society under the laws that are in place. Wong Kim Ark fought for a recognition of his right as a U.S. citizen to return his native country, the United States, after visiting China, where his parents was born. Although the Fourth Amendment protected Wong Kim Ark's citizenship, other written laws still excluded Chinese immigrants from entering the country to work.
The case of Wong Kim Ark in this video is very powerful. He was legally a U.S. citizen because he was born in the United States to parents who are lawfully living there. However, because of his ethnicity, U.S. officials denied him re-entry. This situation was in direct conflict with the citizenship protections of the 14th Amendment.
Decades have passed since the relevant provisions of the 14th Amendment had been written into the statute books for all those provisions to become reality. However, they have had to be enforced by official and interpreted by judges. Not all such enforcers and interpreters were just individuals who felt he had been treated unfairly could always take his case to the court. Although Wang was able to take his case to Supreme Court and was recognized as a U.S. citizen, Chinese were still not granted full memberships in society, even though they were granted the law right to live in the U.S. In reality, they were not granted equal treatment.
So even though Wing Arts case protected one night, it did not solve all the problems regarding the right and all the unfair practice that had arisen in connection with it.
Although Wang Kim Ark was recognized as a U.S. citizen, Chinese were for many more years to come excluded from entry into the U.S. Other court cases were to follow in order to permit the entry of Chinese is large number of the U.S. It was to be a long, slow process of change. This connects to the discussion of the Immigration Act of 1924 that took place in Lecture 9 on Asian Americans. This act, in fact, started Asian exclusion. However, Chinese as well as the other Asians had been restricted for decades period to 1924. In this decade, Chinese and other Asians were seen by the courts as aliens, ineligible for citizenship, and so were subject to problems both entering the U.S. and attempting to become citizens. The Immigration Act of 1924 established a quota of 2% of the population of each country that had been the U.S. territory or had previously been under U.S. administration at the time of the 1890s census. However, for countries in Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as of all of Asia, the quota was set at 0%. Thus, no individuals from these regions would be granted visas to entry in the U.S. Northern and Western European countries, such as Britain and Germany, would be granted as a much larger quota of visas than the previously mentioned regions of the world. These countries were racially classified as being more civilized and thus more able to become good Americans should they choose to become naturalized citizens and thus entry into the mainstream of American society. Thus, the roots of the laws that restricted or prohibited the entry into the country of certain individuals and groups of people was based upon the racial prejudices that existed in America at the time. Another common reason is that immigrants receive suspension from native-born citizens during time of economic stagnation is that they are viewed as outsiders who do not belong in this country. Many view Asian immigrants in this light and have done so historically. Racial stereotypes of immigrants groups have been institutionalized in law restricting and the entry of Central ethnic groups. Such racial prejudices have in turn been reflected in the new restriction on immigration that would be codified in the country's immigration laws for decades to come. The Immigration Act of 1992 added greatly to the role of the federal government in regards to immigrants and enhanced greatly the enforcement of immigration laws and the control of aliens trying to enter the country. To this end, the new immigration law requires the use of visa for certain aliens and required documents from others from entry to the U.S. Also, all arriving aliens and their effects were required to be inspected by immigration officials. Many of the reasons for suspension by native-born citizens in period of economic stagnation center around the issue of the outsider and whether or not he or she belongs in this country. History has shown that in the eyes of many, the Asian immigrant does not belong in this country. 1924 marks an important period in immigration history. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 created a model for excluding a single racial group from entering the country. The Immigration Act of 1924 extended this model of racial exclusion to a national system linked issue of race with those of national origin. Using government controls of immigration of the 1924 Act determined which group would be granted entry into the country and under what circumstance. The Act tied together a number of systems, including those of quotas, of visas, and of borders control in order to achieve its goals. Thus, the Act did more than the place limit on the amount of immigration to the country.
This does not mean to say that people in previous categories of residents automatically become illegal when that category or
documentation.
Documentation required for residency is abolished.
Changing categories and the documentation for legal residents didn't immediately render lawful permanent residence illegal. When the country had reached the quota for new visas for that categories of residents and for admissions for period years quota, documentation requirements and the increased enforcement on entry the country and on re-entry after a trip outside of the country affect individuals attempting to enter the country or re-enter after having left for a time. In this sense, legal and illegal refer status that are defined by policies of governments and thus are changeable various. The status describe attributes of a person that are considered to be fixed. I read the article casting white supremacy themed the Saint Castle of Politic of Belonging by Folu Bariknia. For my paper preparation, the article focuses on the Supreme Court decision in the case of United States versus Bind Signed Saint. The plaintiff Bangri Singh Saint was a Sikh from Punjab. He arrived in the U.S. in 1913 and later served in the United military during World War I. After the war, he was naturalized as a citizen by the district court. However, his decision of naturalization was later changed in the Supreme Court in 1923. The article went on to describe in depth the life of BST, a high-caste Hajj from Punjab, who came to the United States in 1913 to study at the University of California, Berkeley. He was involved in anti-colonial politics, joined at the U.S. military in World War I, was honorably discharged, and later applied for U.S. citizenship. The lawyer of Saint argued that because he was a white descent, he should be considered a free white person and thus granted U.S. citizenship. In Saint's case in 1923, the Supreme Court interpreted the racial requirement rooted in the Naturalization Act of 1790 and 1870. By a vote of 9-0, the judge rejected Saint's racial science argument. The court said that the words white people were words of common speech and should be interpreted according to the understanding of a common man. The decision helped provide a legal base for the Immigration Act of 1924, which later excluded immigrants considered racially ineligible for citizenship and effectively barred source Asian immigration. Baccaronia introduced a second level to the story by interpreting the ways in which Saint attempted to resist racist and unjust system of white supremacy, also relied on another unfair and hierarchical system, caste. Thus, the story of Saint's defeat reveals not only racial exclusion, but also the relationship among race, caste, and belonging. This reading creates more complexity in the already complicated story of BST. On one hand, he was trying to fight against a system of unfair racial classification. On the other hand, he was also trying to gain acceptance in this country by relying on another unfair heresy of which he was a part. Although he lost his case, the decision affected other Indian immigrants in similar circumstances. Through Saint's case, Baccaronia exposed us to the concept of belonging and how both race and caste are used to categorize people.
So Saint was harmed by an unjust law, or was he also supporting another unjust system?
Yeah, I think Saint was justified in trying to challenge a racial law, but asserting a white identity, and relying on caste in order to do so reproduced anti-blackness and caste privilege. As we try to determine who was good or bad in history, we must be careful not to present people as either the perfect hero or the ultimate villain. Each person is complex, and it is possible for someone to fight discriminatory practiced in one way while supporting another unequal system.
From my understanding of this case, the law in one person's case can affect others as well. Are there any other readings that demonstrate this?
I also read a chapter from Impossible Subject by Inga. The chapter is called from a colonial subject to undesirable aliens, Filipino migration in the invisible empire. Inga examines immigration during the period of American colonial rules in the Philippines. The book explores the U.S. memory of its colonial subject and their subsequent travel to the U.S. as laborers and soldiers. The paper specifically explores the experience of Filipinos who became U.S. nationals while residing in the Philippines and who later travels to the U.S. as a laborer or soldier. The relations between the colonial power and the labor between labor and racial hostility are explored. The word empire was never actually written into the immigration status of the time, but American imperial power did shape some feature of these laws as well as the experience of Filipinos migrants in the earlier 20th century. This act of 1934 is also treated at length. Under this act, Filipinos who were previously U.S. aliens became U.S. subjects. They would be entitled to permanent residence in the U.S., but only 50 a year would be allowed to immigrants. This paper examined the memories the U.S. Made of its colonial subject would travel to the U.S. as laborers and soldiers. Specifically, this paper explores the experience of Filipinos who were made U.S. nationals while residing in Filipinos and then traveled to the U.S. This paper examines the relations between the colonial power and its labor, and between the laborers and the racial hostility. The word empire was not written into the immigration status of the time, but American imperial power did shape some of the major features of the laws as well as the experience of the earlier 20th century Filipinos migrants.
The Filipinos were not granted full U.S. citizenship, even though the Philippines was a U.S. colony, because it was in the best interest of the U.S. to use the Filipinos as workers. They would reside in the U.S. under the American government, but would owe allegiance to the U.S. as a national. However, this national would not have equal rights of a U.S. citizen.
The Filipinos were classified as U.S. nationals in the best interest of the U.S. to be used as workers. Filipinos could reside in the U.S. under American government, but they would own allegiance to the USA. National of the Philippines would not have equal rights of the U.S. as a U.S. citizen.
When the U.S. policy made a sharp turn around in the 1930s, the U.S. government prohibits the entry of the Filipino labor into the country. Filipinos were classified as aliens in immigration law under the Acts of 1934.
This shift in how Filipinos were categorized in immigration policy continues to have bearing on current U.S. immigration policy, exposing its rules as a colonial power in the Philippines, and further restricting the entry into the U.S. of increasing numbers of Filipino laborers. A third way of the U.S. immigration policy was transformed as a result of the history of his American rules in Philippines is in the landmark Hart-Celler Act of 1965. Prior to 1965, all immigrants to the U.S. were governed by the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, which removed all racial barriers to nationalize but continued a national origin quota system based on prior laws. In abolishing the national origins quota system, Hart-Celler established a system of immigration based on family ties as well as certain vocational skills, while at the same time placing numerical limits on immigration. This act greatly opened the doors of immigration to people from many Asian countries. It allowed more family members of current residents and people with need skills to apply to enter the country. However, there are still restrictions on the numbers of people allowed to immigrants and many different visa categories. Green card holders may later apply for nationalized citizenship if they meet the legal requirements. This is in contrast to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which restricted the immigration of Chinese laborers. The exclusion from naturalized citizenship came from earlier nationalization laws and the court decision, not from the Chinese Exclusion Act alone. Before learning about this history, how did you view your green card and the U.S. immigration system?
I viewed going through all of these steps and preparing all of the required materials for my own green card application as a very personal process. Following the specific rules outlined by U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service and preparing the necessary documents for permanent residence did not seem to have anything to do with all the concept of race or who was able to belong in a country. However, the list of required documents is the tip of the iceberg of a long history of political decision about who would be allowed to enter the United States and under what circumstances.
I saw the simple material that were required for application for immigration and the simple rules that were required for application to be determined admissible or not. In simple process of waiting for a period of time for approval or denial of applications for immigration, I have no idea that something so simple as materials and rules for a process had such a long history of political decisions by many individuals and many groups over the year.
If unfair law is amended to fight discrimination, can the same discriminatory views appear again in a different form and affect other people?
Changing an unfair law is important, but one legal victory does not remove every other law barrier. Wong Kim Ark confirmed birthright citizenship for most children born in the United States, but the case didn't abolish racial restriction on naturalization or national origin quotas. Those restrictions were changed through later laws and political struggles. Although the law seems so great on paper and even appears good after someone else has read it for you, in reality, after the law has been passed, there are so many factors which affect how one can use a particular regulation, whether or not one can use a regulation to aid their case. This is matter of funding for a start. How much information the public has been given about a new law? What materials and what forms have been made available to help aid case? Whether or not the information has been printed in English, whether or not alien has enough money to pay for a lawyer. The list goes on and on. Each situation is a different case, and each officer is different. The great deal of variation among the officers in the different place where they work in staggering. Laws are necessary a part of life, but are in themselves not sufficient. After a law has been passed, one must go on to ask, who can use a given regulation? Who will be harmed by a new law? Who can assist individuals in asserting their rights with respect to a given legal status? Finally, who are all the individuals who are formerly members of the group, but who are subjected to different forms than other groups' members?
Can immigration law be natural? Every immigration rule involves choice that may benefit some groups while creating barriers for others.
Immigration laws today does not use the same openly racial language found in the immigration laws of 1924. Nonetheless, modern immigration laws are still trying to achieve particular goals. In doing so, lawmaker and choice, but about issues such as quantas, the definitions of family, vocational skills, refugees, and peoples in danger. Earlier immigration's law often took unacceptable forms, as shown by the racial bias incorporated into the laws of 1924. Immigration laws today use different terms, but an important question remains: who does a given role favor, and who will feel the roles to be the greatest barrier to entry? It is too easy to call a legal system natural without examining the political and the economic choice behind it. Of all the examples listed, which one was the most surprising to you?
I was surprised by the first example because uh, Filipinos were once U.S. national who could travel within U.S. territory, but they were not full U.S. citizens. Some Filipinos were loyal to the United States and wanted to become citizens, but were refused. Later, when the United States wanted to control the amount of labor migration from the Philippines, it changed that status under immigration law. The Sind case was also surprising in many ways. At first, I thought Sind was simply fighting racism, but he also relied on the Indian case system and other way of writing people to argue that he was a member of the Caucasian race. This was far from what I expressed.
The examples we went through today were powerful for me. Legal categories of identity can be defined through government policy, regardless of whether people are called foreigners or undocumented immigrants. They are human. They are human beings with families, work, and memories, and they travel for many different reasons.
What are the problems of studying immigration through the lens of law?
A major limitations to viewing immigration through the lens of laws is that there is a government-centric narrative presented of governments acting in order to affect the lives of their immigration population. The actions of governments are documented in congressional debates as well as the decision of courts. However, the actions of subsequent generations of immigrants who challenge their removal from the country and cross the border to join their legal families member, to work to support their families, to organize their co-work into a union to better their working conditions, and to make a home within meaning different from the made by native-born citizens are not recorded. Power can be exercised outside and the exact word of written law, exploring the history of American empire and plantation labor in Hawaii. For example, is useful for understanding a Filipinos case discussed by Enga, Similarly, in immigration and citizenship case, legal actor drew upon case and anti-blackness, as well as racism more broadly. When arguing for or against the inclusion of immigrant groups as citizens, enforcement action and detention practiced about can also shape the meaning of immigration and citizenship as powerfully as a written laws being enforced. The laws of the country cannot capture the full meaning of belonging. Legal citizenship provides rights that no non-citizens may not have, but it does not guarantee that society will accept someone as a full member. Undocumented immigrants and other citizens may also have family and community ties developed over many years. A person's legal identity can open or close many doors, but that legal identity is not the person's total identity, nor does it fully determine that person's home or society acceptance.
This was really good. It's helpful to understand the long history of all of the work that went into the early Asian immigrants' struggles and their perseverance to pave the way for all of us. Like I said before, our situations is different from theirs. All our green cards are personal documents to us, but it's good to see the long history of development behind the paperwork that is involved to get to where we are today and all of the conflicts and the change in history that lead to the immigration laws that we have today.
I just want to say thank you for listening to my thoughts on the issue and for asking thoughtful and relevant questions. Talking with my mom helps me connect the information from from class with our own experience of the immigration system. I don't mean that our green card experience was the same as the experience of earlier immigrants. I learned, however, that many rights available today came from earlier struggles against unfair laws and for recognition, and I don't want to take those rights for granted.